In the far northern edge of the quiet town of Millfield, where paved streets gave way to dirt paths and houses became increasingly scarce, stood the imposing Blackwood Mansion. Built in the late 19th century by the eccentric Dr. Thomas Blackwood, a scientist whose controversial research had made him simultaneously celebrated and infamous in academic circles, the property had remained abandoned for more than 3 decades. Its red bricks, once vibrant, now displayed a faded hue beneath layers of invasive ivy that entwined around the walls like petrified serpents. The tall windows, many with broken glass, resembled empty eyes watching the town with an unsettling, silent vigilance. Local residents avoided traveling on the road that led to the property, especially after sunset, when the shadows cast by the structure seemed to take on a life of their own, stretching like dark fingers toward anyone who dared approach. Stories about nocturnal screams, unexplained lights in the upper windows, and silhouettes observed behind tattered curtains were shared in whispers at local bars and community meetings, feeding the sinister reputation that enveloped the mansion like an invisible shroud. The legends surrounding Blackwood Mansion had multiplied across generations, transforming into warnings that parents passed down to their children and teachers repeated to more adventurous students. It was said that Dr. Blackwood hadn't simply died, as officially announced, but had disappeared during one of his experiments, allegedly seeking to open portals to parallel dimensions. Other rumors suggested that his entire family had been victims of a macabre ritual, and that their spirits remained trapped within the mansion walls, condemned to eternally relive the horrors of their final night. The Millfield Town Council had attempted, on various occasions, to demolish the structure or transform it into a historical museum, but legal complications related to inheritance and strange accidents during preliminary inspections had frustrated all attempts. Over the years, the property was left to its own fate, surrounded by a rusted fence and no trespassing signs that, ironically, served more as invitations to thrill-seeking teenagers than as effective deterrents. Vegetation grew uncontrolled, transforming the once meticulously maintained gardens into a miniature forest, where twisted trees and thorny bushes created a natural labyrinth that seemed to protect the mansion from unwanted visitors, like green guardians of a cursed treasure. It was against this backdrop of mystery and prohibition that 3 elementary school children found themselves on a particularly stormy autumn afternoon. Jason Miller, a 12-year-old boy with messy blonde hair and an impressive collection of scratches on his knees, was known for his impulsive nature and for leading expeditions to the most dangerous locations in town. Emily Chen, with her colorful framed glasses and notebooks always filled with meticulous notes about unexplained phenomena, compensated for Jason's reckless behavior with her analytical and cautious approach. Completing the trio was Lucas Washington, a tall, slender boy with a soft voice and attentive eyes who, despite the constant fear he felt in the face of the unknown, never refused an invitation from his friends, driven by a loyalty that surpassed his self-preservation instinct. That afternoon, what began as a shortcut to avoid the torrential rain transformed into the first chapter of a story that would change not only their lives but the very essence of the small town of Millfield, revealing buried secrets that perhaps should have remained in the depths of the earth, protected by darkness and oblivion. The storm had begun suddenly, transforming the once clear sky into a turbulent mass of grey clouds that poured sheets of water over Millfield. Jason, Emily, and Lucas ran along the dirt road that wound up the hill, their school backpacks bouncing against their backs as they desperately searched for shelter. "Over there!" shouted Jason, pointing to the twisted iron gate that marked the entrance to the Blackwood property. Emily hesitated, her eyes widening behind her rain-fogged glasses. "Are you crazy? Nobody goes in there!" she protested, but her voice was almost completely drowned out by a deafening thunderclap that seemed to shake the very ground beneath their feet. Lucas, trembling as much from cold as from fear, looked nervously at the mansion partially visible through the trees. The dark windows seemed to be watching them, as if the house was aware of their presence and assessing them. But maybe we can just wait in the garden gazebo," he suggested, pointing to a deteriorated wooden structure visible among the trees. "We don't have to go inside the house." Jason was already pushing the gate, which opened with a spine-chilling metallic groan that sounded like a distorted scream. The sound made all 3 freeze momentarily, as if they had just awakened awakened something that had been sleeping for a long time. The path to the gazebo was almost completely overtaken by vegetation, forcing the children to make their way through thorny bushes that seemed to grab at their clothes like desperate hands. Emily noticed strange purple flowers growing in clusters along the path, their petals glowing with an unnatural luminescence even under the storm-darkened sky. "I've never seen this species before," she murmured, resisting the urge to collect a sample. Something about the way the flowers seemed to gently pulse made her uneasy. When they finally reached the gazebo, they discovered that half the roof had collapsed, offering little protection against the rain that now fell horizontally, driven by gusts of wind that howled through the trees. "This isn't going to work," declared Jason, his gaze fixed on the mansion that now seemed much closer and more imposing. "Let's just check if any of the doors are open. We can stay in the entrance hall until the storm passes." Lucas swallowed hard, his face as pale as paper. "My older brother said that whoever goes in there never comes out the same," he whispered. Emily adjusted the strap of her backpack, torn between fear of the legends and the scientific curiosity that always drove her. "That's just superstition," she replied, though her voice betrayed her uncertainty. "Besides, it's just an old house. What could happen?" Little did she know that these words would later be remembered with painful irony. Approaching the mansion revealed details that weren't visible from the road. Stone gargoyles with agonizing expressions adorned the corners of the roof, their mouths open in silent screams, through which rainwater flowed like grotesque tears. The main door, a massive oak structure carved with complex symbols that none of them recognized, was locked, but one of the side windows had a broken pane large enough for them to pass through. "I'll go first," declared Jason, always eager to prove his courage. Carefully avoiding the glass shards, he hoisted himself through the opening and disappeared into the dark interior of the mansion. Emily and Lucas exchanged apprehensive glances before following their friend, driven both by the need to escape the storm and by reluctance to leave him alone in that place. The interior of the mansion smelled of mold, dust, and something else, a metallic and strange odor that Emily couldn't identify but that made her stomach contract. The room they had entered appeared to have been some kind of living room, with furniture covered by white sheets that, in the dim light, resembled ghostly figures frozen in time. Lucas turned on his cell phone flashlight, revealing walls covered with faded wallpaper and dusty paintings depicting somber landscapes and figures with severe expressions. "Must be the Blackwoods," he whispered, pointing to a particularly large portrait where a family of 5, father, mother, and 3 children, posed rigidly. Most disturbing, however, were the faces of the children in the portrait. Their eyes had been carefully scraped from the canvas, leaving unsettling voids that seemed to follow the movements of the 3 friends around the room. "Let's explore a bit while we wait for the rain to stop," suggested Jason, his adventurous spirit quickly overcoming the initial discomfort caused by the mansion's oppressive environment. Emily, who had taken a small notebook from her backpack and was already making notes about the architecture and visible historical details, nodded distractedly. "This place is a treasure trove of local history," she commented, approaching a dusty display case where various strange objects were exhibited. Bronze scientific instruments, glass vials with faded labels, and what appeared to be a small telescope modified with additional lenses and inscriptions engraved on its metallic body. Lucas, on the other hand, stayed close to the window through which they had entered, as if wanting to ensure their escape route remained accessible. "We shouldn't touch anything," he warned, shuddering when a lightning flash briefly illuminated the room through the dirty windows, projecting elongated and distorted shadows on the walls. "My grandmother always says that old objects carry the energy of their owners." Jason rolled his eyes at the superstition, but even he couldn't ignore the growing sensation that they weren't alone in the mansion. The sounds of old wood contracting and expanding with humidity created noises that resembled distant footsteps and muffled whispers. The wind that infiltrated through numerous cracks in the windows and doors produced a continuous and melancholic lament, as if the house itself was expressing some form of ancestral pain that reverberated through its time-worn structures. Moving to the next room, the 3 friends discovered what appeared to have been Dr. Blackwood's main office. Unlike the previous room, this environment showed signs of violent disorder, as if someone had conducted a frantic search. Books, books lay scattered across the floor, their yellowed pages forming a carpet of abandoned knowledge. A massive desk dominated the center of the room, its surface covered with papers, star maps, and complex diagrams that Emily immediately recognized as representations of advanced cosmological theories. "He was studying black holes and string theory," she murmured, impressed with the sophistication of the calculations visible in the notes. "This is decades ahead of the science of his time." Jason had approached a partially collapsed bookshelf where several volumes bound in dark leather caught his attention. Upon pulling one out, he discovered it wasn't a book, but a personal diary, filled with dense, nervous handwriting that became increasingly erratic in the final pages. "Listen to this," he said, reading a passage aloud. "The coordinates are correct, but something is interfering with the portal's stability. The children sense the presence more intensely than I do. Eleanor says they speak to her during sleep. I need to accelerate the preparations before it's too late." Lucas, who had reluctantly approached to hear the reading, noticed a fallen photograph near the desk. When he picked it up, his face grew even paler. The image showed Dr. Blackwood standing before a strange, circular device, but most disturbing was the visible distortion in the air around the apparatus, as if reality itself was bending, and the translucent silhouettes that seemed to emerge from the anomaly. It was Emily who discovered the hidden door behind the partially destroyed bookshelf. Unlike the other entrances in the mansion, this one was made of dark, cold metal, with an elaborate locking system that, surprisingly, appeared to have been violently broken from the inside out. "I think we've found the secret laboratory," she whispered, a mixture of scientific excitement and growing apprehension coloring her voice. Jason was already pushing the heavy door, which opened with a spine-chilling metallic groan, revealing a spiral staircase that descended into darkness. The air emanating from the passage was notably colder and carried an even more intense odor of that strange metallic quality they had noticed earlier. "I really don't think we should go down there," protested Lucas, his voice almost inaudible. But even as he spoke, he knew that Jason had already made his decision, and Emily was clearly torn between fear and the irresistible opportunity to discover the secrets of the disappeared scientist. As if to emphasize the ominous nature of their discovery, a particularly violent thunderclap shook the mansion at that moment, and the lights from their cell phones flickered simultaneously as if affected by some kind of electromagnetic interference. For an instant, in the momentary darkness, they all had the impression of seeing shapes moving in the darkness of the staircase. Not shadows, but something more substantial, elongated figures that seemed to float in the air like conscious smoke. When the lights stabilized, there was nothing visible beyond the metal steps that descended in an apparently endless spiral. "Let's go down," decided Jason, his voice betraying a slight tremor that contradicted his determined expression. After all, what could go wrong? The words hung in the air like an involuntary invocation, a challenge issued to forces they were only beginning to understand. The descent down the spiral staircase seemed endless, each metal step emitting a ghostly echo that reverberated off the damp stone walls. The temperature dropped visibly as they went deeper until their breaths formed small clouds of condensation in front of their faces. The lights from their cell phones cast dancing shadows that seemed to have a life of their own, stretching and contracting on the walls like autonomous entities. Emily silently counted the steps, reaching 77 before they finally reached the bottom. Dr. Blackwood's underground laboratory revealed itself as an impressive circular chamber, much larger than would be possible considering the dimensions of the mansion above. "This doesn't make sense," murmured Emily, her eyes scanning the space with scientific amazement. "This room is geometrically impossible." Nduko. The center of the laboratory was dominated by a circular metal structure that resembled a portal, with strange symbols engraved around its circumference that didn't correspond to any known alphabet. Thick cables, now disconnected and corroded by time, extended from the structure to massive generators positioned at regular intervals around the room. Workbenches filled with scientific equipment, many of which seemed to blend advanced technology with almost ritual elements, formed a secondary ring around the central portal. Most disturbing, however, were the markings on the stone floor, concentric circles deeply carved, filled with what appeared to be a darkened metallic substance. that, even after decades, still maintained an unsettling shine under the light of their improvised flashlights. Lucas was the first to notice the glass capsules aligned against the farthest wall. 6 cylindrical chambers, each large enough to contain a person, filled with a greenish liquid that, inexplicably, had not evaporated after all these years. 3 of the capsules were empty, but the other 3, Jason stifled a scream when his light illuminated the contents of the 4th chamber. A humanoid figure floated in the liquid, but it wasn't completely human. The creature had the basic structure of a child, but its skin possessed a translucent quality that revealed internal organs of strange configuration, and its limbs were disproportionately long, ending in fingers too thin to be natural. Its face, frozen in an expression of agony or ecstasy, it was impossible to determine, had eyes that were too large, completely black, without iris or sclera. "Are they the Blackwood children?" whispered Emily, her voice trembling as she cautiously approached the chambers. The other 2 occupied capsules contained similar creatures, each at a different stage of what appeared to be a horrific transformation. The last one barely retained any recognizable human resemblance, its form having become something closer to an impossible geometry than an organic body. Beside each capsule, small metal plates displayed name: Eleanor, William, and James, the scientists' children, transformed into something beyond human comprehension by experiments whose purpose they could barely imagine. It was Jason who discovered the final diary, carefully sealed in a metal box under the main workbench. Unlike the volumes found in the office, this one was bound in a material that didn't appear to be animal leather, its texture strangely similar to human skin, but with a pattern of pores that none of them recognized. The pages were made of a thin, resilient material that wasn't paper, covered by frantic writing that occasionally abandoned English in favor of complex symbols and 3-dimensional diagrams that seemed to subtly change when observed for too long. "He succeeded," read Jason, his voice echoing strangely in the chamber. "The portal is stable. They are coming. The children were the first to undergo the transformation. Their young bodies are more adaptable to the changes necessary to exist simultaneously in multiple dimensions. Eleanor can see through the veil now. She describes beings of incomprehensible beauty waiting on the other side. Margaret refuses to participate, but it doesn't matter. The work of a lifetime is about to be completed." Emily had approached a section of the floor near the central portal, where the stone appeared to have been disturbed more recently. Using a metal bar found nearby, she began to carefully excavate, revealing an octagonal box made of a black metal that absorbed light in an unnatural way, creating the impression of a 3-dimensional void in space. The box had no visible clasps or hinges, but when the 3 friends approached simultaneously, it emitted a soft click, and its lid opened like the petals of a mechanical flower, revealing its contents: a spherical device the size of a tennis ball, composed of concentric metal rings that rotated independently around a pulsating crystalline core that emitted a hypnotic blue-green light. The moment the light touched their faces, the 3 felt a vertiginous sensation, as if for an instant they could perceive layers of reality normally invisible to human senses. The spherical device began to spin more rapidly, its metal rings emitting a growing hum that reverberated off the walls of the underground laboratory. The blue-green light intensified, projecting complex geometric patterns in the air around the children, impossible shapes that seemed to fold in on themselves at angles that shouldn't exist in 3-dimensional space. "Don't touch it!" shouted Emily, but it was too late. Jason, hypnotized by the alien beauty of the object, had already extended his hand toward the crystalline core. The instant his fingers brushed the pulsating surface, an invisible wave of energy exploded from the device, knocking the 3 friends down and causing the lights on their cell phones to flicker frantically before going out completely. In the sudden darkness, they could see that the metal portal in the center of the laboratory had begun to glow with the same unsettling light, its engraved symbols burning as if they had been filled with liquid fire. The air inside the metal circle shimmered, distorting like the surface of a disturbed lake, and through this distortion, for a terrible moment, they glimpsed another place, a vast space that seemed simultaneously an infinite abyss and an impossible architecture of crystalline towers that extended in all directions, inhabited by forms that their brains refused to process completely, leaving only fragmented impressions of elongated elongated limbs, reflective surfaces, and eyes. Dozens, hundreds of eyes that suddenly turned in their direction as if they had just noticed they were being observed. The sound that followed could not be adequately described as a noise. It was more like a physical sensation, a vibration that hit not just their ears but every cell in their bodies, carrying with it a meaning that transcended language. Lucas was the first to understand the danger. "We have to get out of here now," he shouted, his normally timid voice carrying an urgency that shook the other two from their momentary trance. As they stood up, staggering, they could hear sounds coming from the spiral staircase, not footsteps, but a wet, dragging slither, as if something large and without a defined bone structure was approaching. Emily, with surprising presence of mind, grabbed the skin-bound diary and stuffed it into her backpack. Jason, in turn, quickly closed the octagonal box, interrupting the energy flow to the portal, whose light began to gradually diminish. The distortions in the air, however, persisted, and through them they could see that the entities on the other side were agitated, moving in ways that defied the laws of physics as they tried to reach the rapidly closing opening. "Is there another way out?" asked Jason, his gaze frantically scanning the laboratory walls, while the sound on the staircase drew closer. It was Lucas who noticed the small circular door almost hidden behind one of the massive generators. "There!" he indicated, already running toward the possible escape route. The door, which more resembled a submarine hatch, opened with difficulty, revealing a narrow tunnel that extended horizontally into darkness. The three friends crawled through the claustrophobic tunnel, their clothes tearing on the metal protrusions that projected from the walls at irregular intervals. The air became increasingly rarefied, and a strong odor of damp earth and vegetable decomposition indicated they were approaching the surface. After what seemed like an eternity of desperate movement, they emerged through an opening, partially covered by roots and vegetation, finding themselves in the abandoned cemetery that lay at the back of the Blackwood property. The rain had diminished to a light drizzle, and the sky was beginning to clear on the horizon, suggesting they had spent much more time inside the mansion than they had imagined. As they hurriedly moved away, stumbling between tilted tombstones and time-corroded angel statues, Lucas looked back one last time. The silhouette of the Blackwood mansion was outlined against the dawning sky, and for a terrible instant he swore he saw elongated and distorted figures watching them through every window on the top floor, figures that cast no shadows and whose movements seemed disconnected from any recognizable anatomy. In the days that followed, Millfield began to experience inexplicable phenomena, electrical failures that affected only certain houses in patterns that, seen from above, formed the same symbols engraved on the portal, domestic animals that disappeared during the night only to return days later, behaving in strange ways and avoiding eye contact with their owners, and most disturbing, reports of shared dreams among residents, visions of a crystalline city under alien skies, where beings of impossible geometry invited the dreamers to cross over and join them in a world of expanded perception. For Jason, Emily, and Lucas, the consequences of their adventure manifested in deeply personal ways. Jason began to develop an unusual sensitivity to electromagnetic fields, being able to feel electronic devices even when turned off and predict storms with unsettling accuracy hours before any visible sign in the sky. Emily discovered she could instinctively understand mathematical and physical concepts that were far beyond the school curriculum, filling entire notebooks with equations and theories that university professors consulted by her parents described as revolutionary but impossible. Lucas, perhaps the most affected of the three, began having episodes where he briefly saw what he called layers, moments when reality seemed to become transparent, revealing other versions of the same space existing simultaneously, some inhabited by altered versions of known people, others by entities he refused to describe, limiting himself to saying they did not have the same relationship with space that we do. The diary that Emily had rescued proved to be a source of both knowledge and danger. Its pages contained not only records of Dr. Blackwood's experiments, but also detailed detailed instructions for constructing devices capable of manipulating the barriers between dimensions. In a unanimous decision, the three friends agreed to hide the diary, burying it in a secret location in the woods on the outskirts of town, marked only by a specific arrangement of stones that only they would recognize. Even so, on particularly quiet nights, each of them could feel a kind of mental calling, as if the knowledge contained in those strange pages exerted a gravitational attraction on their consciousnesses, inviting them to unearth it and continue the work that Dr. Blackwood had begun decades earlier. The Blackwood Mansion, which for decades had been merely a silent spectre on the periphery of Millfield, became the epicenter of a subtle but undeniable transformation that spread through the town like ripples on a lake. Local authorities, alerted by growing reports of inexplicable phenomena, finally organized an official investigation of the property, only to discover that the underground laboratory had been completely sealed by an unexplained collapse, as if the Earth itself had decided to swallow the secrets that resided there. Material specialists were perplexed by samples collected from the mansion's exterior walls, which demonstrated impossible properties, absorbing light at certain wavelengths while amplifying others, creating a visual effect of partial translucency at dusk. Tourists and paranormal enthusiasts began visiting the town, attracted by rumors that spread rapidly across the internet, transforming Millfield from a forgotten community into a pilgrimage destination for those fascinated by the inexplicable. The local economy flourished with the opening of souvenir shops, guided tours, and even a small museum dedicated to the history of Dr. Blackwood and his theories about adjacent realities. Ironically, the mansion that had been avoided for so long became the unofficial symbol of the town, its somber profile stamped on t-shirts, mugs, and postcards sold in stores on Main Street. Few noticed that the stylized symbols incorporated into these tourist designs were precise reproductions of those engraved on the dimensional portal, now spread throughout the town like invisible seeds of an alternative reality planted in the fabric of everyday life. Jason, Emily, and Lucas found themselves involuntarily transformed into guardians of a secret that was simultaneously wonderful and terrible. Their lives, previously defined by typical adolescent concerns, now orbited around the forbidden knowledge they had acquired and the inexplicable changes that continued to manifest in their bodies and minds. Jason, whose electromagnetic abilities had intensified, discovered he could subtly influence electronic devices with his mind, a talent he used with caution and only in emergency situations, such as when he remotely deactivated the hospital's alarm system to allow Emily to visit her father outside, visiting hours after a sudden heart attack. Emily, in turn, channeled her newly discovered understanding of advanced physics into scientific projects that earned her scholarships to prestigious universities, though she carefully limited her publications to concepts that the academic world was prepared to accept. Lucas, perhaps the most deeply transformed, developed a psychic sensitivity that allowed him to detect when the layers between dimensions became temporarily thinner in certain locations, points he meticulously mapped in a personalized atlas of the town, creating a record of permeability zones that the three friends regularly monitored. Together, they formed a silent alliance, meeting weekly to share observations and discuss strategies to contain any more dangerous manifestations of the interdimensional phenomena they had inadvertently unleashed. In one of these meetings, held in Emily's room decorated with posters of famous scientists and complex hand-drawn diagrams, Lucas presented a disturbing theory. "I think we didn't find the device," he whispered, his eyes reflecting knowledge beyond his years. "I think it found us. That we were meant to activate it as part of something much larger that began long before we were born." As the years passed, the three friends realized they had become part of a much older and more complex legacy than they had initially imagined. Careful research in historical archives revealed that Dr. Blackwood had not been the first to experiment with the barriers between dimensions in Millfield. The very location of the mansion coincided with what centuries earlier the Native Americans of the region had designated as a place where worlds touch, a sacred site where shamans performed rituals to communicate with those who walk between. Colonial records mentioned inexplicable phenomena in the same area, attributed at the time to witchcraft or demonic intervention. The region's history seemed dotted with cycles of discovery and concealment, as if the veil between dimensions periodically became thinner, allowing glimpses and interactions before reinforcing itself again. During a nighttime expedition to the abandoned cemetery at the back of the Blackwood property, now part of their regular monitoring ritual, the three friends made a discovery that finally connected all the dots. An ancient crypt, partially submerged, whose inner walls were covered with the same symbols found on the laboratory portal. In the center of the crypt, a stone pedestal supported the fragmented remains of a spherical device, identical to the one they had found, but much older, dating, according to Emily's subsequent analysis, from at least 3,000 years ago. "We are not the first, nor will we be the last," concluded Jason, his voice carrying the weight of understanding. "We are just the guardians of this generation." Emily nodded, her fingers delicately tracing the symbols on the wall that she could now partially read thanks to her studies of Blackwood's diary. "Each cycle brings the veil closer to permanently tearing," she translated. "Each opened portal leaves a lasting mark." Lucas, who had developed the habit of always carrying a modified compass that reacted to dimensional anomalies, observed that the needle spun continuously in that location, unable to find a stable magnetic north. "They are always watching, always waiting," he murmured, looking at the shadows that seemed to move in an unnatural way in the corners of the crypt. "And now we are too." Millfield would never be the same after the events triggered on that stormy afternoon when three children sought shelter in the Blackwood mansion. The town, once an insignificant point on the map, transformed into a nexus where the boundaries of reality became permeable, a place where the impossible occasionally manifested in everyday life. For most residents and visitors, these manifestations were merely curiosities, unexplained lights photographed over the ancient cemetery, audio recordings that captured voices when no one was speaking, reflections in windows that didn't correspond to the people in front of them, phenomena easily dismissed as illusions or fabrications by skeptics, but revered as proof by those inclined to believe. Few understood the true nature of what had been altered in the fundamental structure of that piece of reality, and fewer still knew of the role that three ordinary teenagers played in maintaining a fragile balance between worlds that should never touch. Jason, Emily, and Lucas grew up under the weight of this forbidden knowledge, their lives shaped by a responsibility they hadn't chosen, but accepted with a maturity that transcended their age. Their individual trajectories seemingly divergent, Jason becoming an electrical engineer, specializing in experimental communication technologies, Emily dedicating herself to theoretical astrophysics with a focus on wormholes and quantum physics, Lucas developing a career as an archaeologist with particular interest in sites associated with ancient rituals, were in fact facets of a shared purpose. Each, in their own way, sought to better understand the forces they had encountered in the mansion and develop methods to monitor and, when necessary, contain the consequences of that fateful encounter. Their combined knowledge formed an interdisciplinary surveillance system that identified patterns invisible to those not initiated into the secrets of adjacent realities. On specific nights, when particular constellations aligned over Millfield and readings from the specialized instruments they had developed indicated a thinning of the dimensional veil, the three returned to the mansion, now officially a historical museum they had helped establish precisely to ensure legitimate access to the site. In a secret room built within the original walls and accessible only by a mechanism that responded to their combined biometrics, they maintained their sanctuary of knowledge and vigilance. Maps of the town marked with points of anomalous activity covered one wall. Another displayed monitoring screens connected to sensors discreetly installed in strategic locations. A third was dedicated to partial translations of the symbols found on the portal and in the ancient crypt, slowly forming a lexicon of a language that existed in the interstices between dimensions. In the center of the room, protected by layers of safeguards both technological and esoteric, rested Dr. Blackwood's diary, no longer buried, but carefully studied under controlled conditions, its dangerous knowledge tamed and channeled for protective purposes. What began as a childish adventure transformed into an intergenerational legacy as each of them began, with extreme caution, to identify and guide sensitive young people who demonstrated abilities similar to their own, open minds that could perceive the ripples in reality that most ignored. The Blackwood Mansion, once feared and avoided, became the center of an unofficial order of dimensional guardians, its purpose known only to a chosen few. And in the depths of the earth, sealed by tons of concrete and protected by technologies derived partially from interdimensional knowledge, the portal remained, inactive but never truly dormant, for some doors once opened can never be completely closed. Some boundaries once crossed remain forever marked by the passage. In shared dreams, the three friends occasionally glimpsed the crystalline city under alien skies and felt the gaze of its inhabitants, beings of vast consciousness and impossible geometry, turned in their direction across the abyss between worlds. A silent reminder that human curiosity is simultaneously our greatest virtue and our deepest danger, and that some mysteries once unearthed forever transform those who discover them, making them part of a much larger story that continues to unfold in the shadows of everyday reality, invisible to most, but eternally present for those with eyes to see.